What kind of mother pushes her child on a swing for 48 hours? Straight? No food? No water? No comfort? Just relentless pushing until silence? This isn't a fictional nightmare. This is the true story of Romechia Sims and her 3-year-old son, Ji'Aire Lee. A case that will force you to confront the unimaginable. How could a mother do this? How could a community not see? How could a little boy be lost in plain sight? Welcome to Crime Stories Network. I thank you, my viewers, for your support as we keep bringing true crime stories, especially against children, abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Please don't forget to subscribe to this channel. To understand the heartbreaking events that unfolded, we have to go back to the beginning, to a time when hope was still bright, and a little boy named Ji'Aire Lee was the center of his family's world. He was born in August of 2011, and right away, everyone called him G. It was a sweet nickname for a little spark of life that came into a family that was just starting to build itself. His parents, Romechia Sims and James Lee, had a classic meet-cute story, something you might see in a movie. It was 2008, and they met at a basketball game. James was working security there, and Romechia was in the crowd. They caught each other's eye, started talking, and pretty soon they were spending all their time together. They were both living in Clinton, Maryland, a nice, small town where people knew their neighbors. By 2010, Romechia and James were excited and a little nervous because they found out they were going to have a baby. Money was tight. Romechia was living with her mom, Vasha Sims, and James was sharing an apartment with a friend. They weren't living in luxury, that's for sure, but they were happy. They were starting a family, and that's what mattered most. In August 2011, their son, Ji'Aire, was born. He was their little miracle. From day one, Ji'Aire was a bundle of energy. He was always moving, always curious. He loved watching cartoons, like most kids of his age. He'd sit there, eyes glued to the screen, laughing at the silly characters. He loved imagining himself as someone strong and brave, just like the characters he saw on TV. But more than anything, Ji'Aire loved his family. Being with his mom and dad, playing with his toys, just being held close, that's what made him happiest. In 2013, things started to look like they were really coming together for the family. James managed to rent a small 2-bedroom apartment in La Plata, Maryland. It wasn't fancy, but it was theirs. Finally, Romechia, James, and Ji'Aire could live together as a family, all in one place. For Romechia, who had been living with her mother, this was a big step. It was her own space, her own home to make for her son. For James, it was a promise kept, a way to provide for his family. And for Ji'Aire, at just 2 years old, it was simply home, a place where he felt safe and loved. Ji'Aire's older cousin became his best buddy. They were always together, playing for hours. You could often find them outside kicking a soccer ball around, or inside, their faces lit up by the glow of video games. For a little while, they were a picture of a happy family. They were making it work, building a life, creating those everyday memories that families cherish. But, like for so many families, life can be unpredictable. By 2014, things started to get tough for Romechia and James. They started having problems, relationship issues that put a strain on everything. After a while, Romechia and James made a really hard decision. They decided to separate. It was tough, but they thought it was the best thing for everyone. James moved out and went back to sharing an apartment with a friend. Romechia stayed in the apartment in La Plata with Ji'Aire. Even though they weren't together anymore, James was still there for Ji'Aire. He helped Romechia out financially, and he made sure he was still a dad to his son. Romechia was determined to make things work too. She kept her job as a sales associate, and she was also going to college. She had big dreams of becoming a teacher. She wanted a good life for Ji'Aire, and she was working hard to make that happen. Even though things had changed, they were trying to keep things as normal as possible for Ji'Aire. Think about Ji'Aire at that age, just 2 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. He was innocent, happy, and loved. He didn't know about the troubles his parents were going through. All he knew was his family, his home, and his toys. These were simple, good times, moments of peace and joy before everything changed. Before the darkness started to creep in, and before a tragedy that no one could have imagined would turn their world upside down. But who was Romechia Sims, really? Beyond the headlines, beyond the tragic events that would define her story, there was a woman with dreams, with ambitions, with a life she was trying to build. She wasn't just a headline, she was a person, a mother, a daughter. Before the darkness took hold, Romechia was known for her resilience. Life hadn't always been easy, but she faced challenges head-on. She had goals, things she wanted to achieve. Becoming a teacher wasn't just a job for her. It was a calling. She wanted to make a difference, to guide young minds, to create a positive impact. It was a testament to her determination, her desire to create a better future for herself and for Ji'Aire. But sometimes, life throws you a curveball that can knock you off your feet. For Romechia, that curveball came in the form of job loss. Losing her job as a sales associate wasn't just a financial setback. It was like the foundation of her life started to crumble. Suddenly, the already tight budget became impossible to manage. The bills piled up, the rent was due, and the pressure to provide for Ji'Aire became overwhelming. It was a moment of intense stress, a breaking point that seemed to trigger something deep within her mind. Could this kind of financial pressure push anyone to the edge? Have you ever felt that kind of desperation where everything feels like it's closing in? Along with the voices came paranoia, a deep, unsettling feeling that she was being watched, followed, that unseen forces were at play against her. Everyday situations became threatening. She started experiencing hallucinations, seeing things that weren't there, hearing things no one else could hear. One of the most common and terrifying hallucinations was the doorbell. It would ring, a normal, everyday sound, but for Romechia, it was a signal of danger. She'd rush to the door, heart pounding, expecting to see a friendly face, a neighbor, maybe a delivery. But when she opened it, nothing. No one there. Except, in her mind's eye, in her distorted reality, there were people. Armed figures, lurking in the shadows, waiting to attack. Can you imagine the terror of living with that kind of fear, where your own senses betray you? Terrified, Romechia reached out to her family, to her mother, Vasha, and her stepfather. She'd call them, voice trembling, sometimes in the middle of the night, convinced she was in imminent danger. "They're trying to kill me," she would plead. Vasha and her stepfather, deeply worried, would rush to Romechia's apartment, time and time again. They searched the apartment, checked outside, looked for any sign of these phantom attackers, but each time they found nothing. Everything seemed normal, quiet. There was no one there but Romechia and Ji'Aire, and the growing fear in Romechia's eyes. To try and understand what was happening, to find some kind of proof. Her family even asked for security camera footage from around her apartment building. They hoped to see something, some clue to explain Romechia's terror. But the footage was empty. No shadowy figures, no armed men, just empty hallways and quiet streets. It became chillingly clear. The danger wasn't outside Romechia's apartment. It was inside her mind. In February of 2015, the crisis reached a breaking point. Romechia called James, Ji'Aire's father, in a state of panic. She was incoherent, terrified, convinced someone was inside her apartment, trying to get her. James, caught at work, did the only thing he could think of. He called Vasha. Once again, Vasha rushed to her daughter's apartment, and this time, when she arrived, she saw it. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something profoundly disturbing. Romechia was acting even stranger than before. She was disoriented, confused, and it took her a long time to even recognize her own mother. Vasha, seeing her daughter in this state, knew this was beyond anything she could handle on her own. She realized Romechia needed professional help immediately. She took Romechia to the hospital. After a series of tests and evaluations at the hospital, the diagnosis came back: paranoid schizophrenia and depression. It was a heavy diagnosis, a life-altering revelation, but it was also an explanation, a name for the terrifying experiences Romechia had been enduring. Doctors prescribed medication, antipsychotics, and antidepressants, designed to stabilize her mind, to quiet the voices, to bring her back to reality. Romechia was discharged with a prescription and instructions. Take this medication daily. It was the only way to manage her condition, to keep the hallucinations at bay, to regain some control over her life. Vasha knew her daughter needed constant support, daily supervision to ensure she took her medication and stayed safe. So, she made a difficult but loving offer. Romechia and Ji'Aire should move back in with her. Romechia, unemployed, struggling to make ends meet, facing the daunting cost of prescription medication, accepted her mother's offer. They moved into the Deluxe Inn, a roadside hotel where Vasha was living. It wasn't a long-term solution, it wasn't ideal, but it was a roof over their heads, a place where Vasha could keep a close eye on Romechia. It was meant to be a temporary refuge, a stepping stone to getting back on their feet. But tragically, it was also a place where the seeds of disaster were already sown. Unbeknownst to Vasha, and perhaps even to Romechia herself, the medication, the lifeline that could have saved them, would soon be abandoned. And the voices would return, stronger and more menacing than ever before, setting the stage for the unimaginable events to come. Looking back, knowing what we know now, you have to wonder, could anyone have seen this coming? Were there more warning signs that were missed? And at what point could this tragedy have been prevented? These are the questions that haunt this case, questions that linger long after the headlines fade. Life at the Deluxe Inn. It was anything but deluxe. Imagine a place built for temporary stays, not for families trying to heal, not for someone battling a serious mental illness. It was a roadside hotel, the kind of place people pass through, not settle down in. And for Romechia and Ji'Aire, it became a pressure cooker. The thin walls offered little privacy, and the atmosphere was often charged with tension. It wasn't a home, it was a temporary stop, and a deeply unstable one at that. Almost immediately after Romechia and Ji'Aire moved in with Vasha, things started to deteriorate. The close quarters, the underlying stress, and Romechia's untreated mental illness created a volatile environment. Neighbors in the hotel started noticing things. They reported hearing constant arguments erupting from Vasha's room. Raised voices, angry words echoing through the hallways, becoming a disturbing fixture of life at the deluxe inn. These weren't just disagreements. They were heated conflicts, fueled by frustration and, perhaps, by the growing paranoia in Romechia's mind. What must it have been like for Ji'Aire, caught in the middle of this tension, hearing his mother and grandmother arguing constantly? How does a child process that kind of stress in their own home, or what was supposed to be home? Whispers began to circulate among the hotel residents, whispers about more than just arguments, whispers about how Ji'Aire was being treated. Rumors of mistreatment, of neglect, started to spread. Some neighbors claimed they heard yelling directed at the little boy, sounds of distress coming from behind closed doors. While these were just whispers, they painted a disturbing picture of what life was like inside room at the deluxe inn. And it wasn't just rumors. Disturbingly, there are even police records documenting incidents at the hotel involving Romechia and Ji'Aire. Records of domestic disturbances, of Romechia becoming physically violent towards her own mother, the very person who was trying to help her, to provide a roof over her head and support, became the target of her anger and confusion. The deluxe inn, intended as a safe haven, was quickly becoming a place of escalating conflict and fear. Then, in February of 2015, just weeks after moving into the hotel, another argument exploded between Romechia and Ji'Aire. We don't know exactly what triggered it, but in that moment, something snapped. Romechia, in a burst of impulsivity, declared she was leaving. She couldn't stay there any longer, she said. Driven by what? Frustration? The voices? We can only speculate. But in that moment, she made a decision that would set in motion a chain of tragic events. She quickly gathered a few belongings, took Ji'Aire by the hand, and announced she was going to James's apartment. She hailed a taxi outside the deluxe inn and got in with Ji'Aire. But she hadn't called James. She hadn't told him she was coming. It was a spontaneous, unplanned escape. Ji'Aire watched from the hotel doorway as the taxi pulled away with her daughter and grandson inside. A wave of unease washed over her. She had a bad feeling, a sense that something was terribly wrong. Driven by that instinct, Ji'Aire immediately picked up the phone and called James. She told him about the argument, about Romechia leaving, about her heading towards his apartment. It was a frantic, worried call, a desperate attempt to alert James to a situation spiraling out of control. But hours passed, and Romechia didn't arrive at James's apartment. He waited, growing increasingly anxious. He tried calling Romechia's cell phone, but there was no answer. Dread began to creep in. Something was definitely wrong. James decided he couldn't just sit and wait any longer. He got in his car and started driving, retracing the most likely route a taxi would take from the deluxe inn to his apartment. He drove slowly, carefully scanning the sides of the road, his heart pounding with each passing mile. And then, in the darkness, he saw them. Not at his apartment, not anywhere near it, but wandering aimlessly close to a highway. Romechia was there, disoriented, confused, walking erratically, and beside her, or rather, being half-dragged along, was little Ji'Aire. James pulled over immediately, his blood running cold at the sight before him. What James discovered was horrifying. Romechia, lost in a powerful hallucination, believed they were being chased, pursued by some unseen threat. In her terror, she had done the unthinkable. She had opened the taxi door while it was still moving and jumped out, pulling her 3-year-old son with her onto the side of a busy road. It was night-time, the weather was freezing, and Ji'Aire was completely unprepared for the cold. He was barefoot, wearing only a thin fabric pajama, shivering uncontrollably in the frigid air. Further down the road, James found Romechia's purse, their scattered belongings, dropped in their desperate, imagined flight from danger. He scooped up Romechia and Ji'Aire, bundled them into his car, and raced to the nearest hospital. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that something had gone terribly wrong. This wasn't just a bad day. This was a crisis. And Ji'Aire was caught in the middle of it. At the hospital, the full extent of Romechia's mental breakdown became tragically clear. Doctors confirmed what James already suspected. Romechia had stopped taking her medication. Her paranoid schizophrenia had not just returned, it was spiraling, unchecked, out of control. She was deeply unwell, and in that state, James realized with a chilling clarity, she was not capable of caring for herself, let alone her young son. In that hospital room, seeing Ji'Aire shivering, vulnerable, and Romechia lost in her own world of delusion, James made a heart-wrenching decision. He knew he had to do everything in his power to protect his son. He had to fight for Ji'Aire's safety, even if it meant confronting the devastating reality of Romechia's illness and the painful complexities of their family. In March 2015, James, desperate to protect Ji'Aire, filed for full custody, presenting Romechia's hospitalizations and the taxi incident as evidence of her inability to care for their son. Tragically, his pleas to the court would ultimately be unsuccessful, and the system would fail to provide the protection Ji'Aire desperately needed. Just days after the devastating custody hearing, on May 18, 2015, Romechia made a fateful decision driven by her untreated mental illness. She stopped taking her medication again. Unaware of this, Vasha couldn't intervene as the voices returned, stronger and more commanding than ever, shaping Romechia's reality and intensifying her hallucinations. Vasha, Romechia's mother, wasn't aware of this critical decision. She couldn't intervene, couldn't stop the chain of events that were now set in motion, and as Romechia's medication left her system, the voices returned. Not as faint whispers this time, but as loud, clear, and commanding pronouncements. They weren't suggestions, they were directives. Inescapable commands from a reality that existed only within Romechia's mind. The hallucinations intensified, blurring the lines between what was real and what was imagined, pushing her further and further away from the world the rest of us inhabit. May 20th, 2015. Wednesday. Romechia's actions became increasingly disconnected from the world around her. She spoke to Vasha, her words fragmented, disjointed, hinting at strange pills, unseen strangers, a shared delusion that made no sense to her mother. That same day, Romechia told Vasha she was taking Ji'Aire out for the day. A normal mother-son outing, or so it seemed on the surface. She said they were going to the pharmacy first, to pick up something for Ji'Aire's cold, then to grab some fast food for lunch, and finally to spend some time at a local park. A seemingly ordinary plan for a Wednesday in May. Around 11:15 in the morning, Romechia and 3-year-old Ji'Aire arrived at the park. It was a public park, a place for families, for children to play, for people to enjoy the fresh air. Romechia walked over to the swing sets and gently placed Ji'Aire on one of the swings. She started to push him back and forth, back and forth. The sun was out, maybe other children were playing nearby, enjoying the spring day. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like a perfectly normal scene, a mother and son at the park. But for Romechia and for little Ji'Aire, this park was about to become the stage for a horrifying, unimaginable ordeal. Hours began to slip by. The afternoon wore on. Daylight started to fade, slowly surrendering to the approaching evening. And still, Romechia remained in the park, pushing Ji'Aire on the swing, back and forth, under the darkening sky. What was Ji'Aire experiencing during those agonizing hours? Did he understand what was happening? Did he cry out for his mother, for help, for comfort? Or was he already lost in a world of confusion and fear, unable to comprehend the endless, relentless motion of the swing? We can only imagine his silent suffering, his growing distress as the day turned into night, and the pushing never stopped. As darkness deepened, and Romechia still hadn't returned home, Vasha's worry turned into alarm. She tried calling Romechia's cell phone again and again. Finally, Romechia answered. Vasha, her voice tight with anxiety, asked where they were, when they would be home. Romechia's response was strangely detached, almost robotic. "Everything is fine," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We'll be back soon." Just a few words, a hollow reassurance that did nothing to ease Vasha's growing fear. "Soon," Romechia promised. But soon never came. It was a false assurance, an empty promise echoing in the gathering darkness. Vasha waited, pacing anxiously in her hotel room, the night stretching out, each minute feeling like an eternity. But Romechia and Ji'Aire did not come back to the deluxe inn that night, or the next day, or the night after that. They remained in the park, and no one, it seemed, noticed. No one intervened, until it was tragically, irrevocably too late. On Friday morning, May 22, 2015, after 2 days and nights in the park, a concerned park-goer noticed Romechia and Ji'Aire still on the swing set. His unease led him to call the police, revealing the horrific truth. Police arrived to find Romechia still pushing the swing, and Ji'Aire, tragically, lifeless. Will's Memorial Park, once a place of joy, became a crime scene. Romechia, questioned at the park, spoke of voices commanding her to stay and push Ji'Aire. Ji'Aire's autopsy confirmed the cause of death: dehydration and hypothermia, a homicide by neglect. News of Ji'Aire's death spread rapidly, shocking the nation and raising profound questions about how such a tragedy could happen and how the system failed to protect him. James was devastated, haunted by what-ifs and the system's failure to heed his warnings. Vasha was left to grieve Ji'Aire while also confronting the devastating reality of Romechia's mental illness. In the aftermath, the stark reality was a dead child, a mother lost in her mind, and a family shattered, leaving the question, could this have been prevented? In February 2016, Romechia Sims faced the legal system, charged with involuntary manslaughter. The prosecution acknowledged her mental illness, and Romechia pleaded guilty. Expert testimony from Dr. Thomas Hyde detailed her chronic paranoid schizophrenia, and his opinion that she was psychotically detached from reality during the incident. Judge Stephen Platt, acknowledging the tragic loss but also Romechia's mental state, ruled she was not fully responsible. Her sentence focused on treatment, release with strict conditions of intensive mental health care, medication, supervision, and no unsupervised contact with children. It was a controversial decision, raising questions about justice, accountability, and whether treatment could truly provide closure. Ji'Aire Lee's story is a preventable tragedy, a culmination of system failures and a mental health crisis. We must remember Ji'Aire not just as a victim, but as a loved child. Romechia, too, lives with immense grief. Ji'Aire's story must be a call to action, to demand better mental health care, stronger support systems, and community vigilance. We must ask ourselves if we are doing enough and commit to creating a society where such tragedies never happen again. Let us remember Ji'Aire and act to protect the vulnerable. The story of Romechia Sims and Ji'Aire Lee leaves us with so much to think about, doesn't it? It raises some really tough questions, questions that don't have easy answers, but questions we need to ask ourselves as a society. What do you think about the judge's decision in this case? Was it a fair outcome? Was justice served for Ji'Aire? And what about community responsibility? Could anything have been done differently to help Romechia and protect Ji'Aire before tragedy struck? Let's start a conversation. Your voice and your perspective are important. If you're interested in learning more about real and impactful true crime stories like this one, just hit that subscribe button right now and don't forget to turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our future videos. We're committed to bringing you thoughtful, in-depth stories that matter. Thank you for watching.